Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me in the cheap seats. Can you? Good. You can. It's all right. Because if I crouch for the microphones, you'll see the top of my toupee, and that will not suit at all. Well, false modesty prompts me to distance myself from Karen's generous, indeed over-generous remarks. On the other hand, I think I should not dissent from anything the Iamoi of Okuku says, and so I shall endorse her comments wholeheartedly and indeed with great enthusiasm. It's not my job to issue the thanks or add to them that Karen has so excellently described for us and the tribute she paid. I would, however, like to thank the organizers for the tremendous work they have done. You only have to organize a big conference once to know that you can dine out on the episodes for years afterwards, and prompted by that brilliant introduction, I'm already recording thoughts for my own memoirs. An episode about a heart-shaped waterbed comes to mind, but we won't do that. I should particularly, if it's not causing any offence to other stalwarts, like to mention the name of Benedetta Rossi, who has worked especially hard and has shown not only patience in dealing with this panel alone, but a great sense of good humour. It's a particular honour to be part of this special event and indeed celebration. It so happens that it is 50 years this week since I was appointed an assistant lecturer at this university, and one day I shall acquire the grey hair to prove it. John Fage gave me my start in academic life and supported me to and through and beyond his own retirement. I was his first PhD student, as Karen mentioned, though by no means the best. That distinction goes to others, and among those present, to take out a little insurance, as Robin Law. However, I did have a special vantage point in being able to observe the contribution he made to Birmingham University from the outset. Though, as I fear is often the case, youthful inexperience and preoccupation with my own career prevented me from appreciating his qualities to the full until much later. Now, of course, I think I understand better what I then took for granted. John's reputation and standing as a pioneering historian of Africa opened doors that might otherwise have been closed. He was an ever conscientious supervisor who paid attention to detail and scattered commas across what I thought was my perfect script with an abandon that even now, when I think about it, mesmerizes me. But he also queried in his characteristically low-key manner some of my wilder ideas that, if left unrestrained, would not have deserved the commas he subsequently inserted. As director, John presided over a centre that gained a reputation within the university, then nationally, and ultimately internationally. It is a tribute to his successors that the reputation has not only been maintained, but enhanced. John's management style reflected his personality. It was liberal, even-handed, and tolerant. John was as modest in his assessment of himself as he was generous in his appraisal of others. He believed in giving people their chance and letting them make of it what they will. The directorship must have seemed to him at times to be like herding cats, but he never allowed the feeling, if it existed, to show or to influence his conduct of other matters. His equanimity, however, was not the product of insensitivity, but was exercised to further his deep interest in the welfare and progress of his younger colleagues. New members of staff would sometimes consult me anxiously about approaching him with a particularly sensitive problem. I would advise them that they could walk into his office with their heads under their arms, announce that they had an issue they wished to discuss, and John would invite them to sit down with all his calm civility and tell him all about it, and more often than not, come up with a solution. I owe him more than I can repay, even though I know that John, ever a gentleman, would never seek repayment. I'm sure that members of the conference would like to know that I've received a note from Roland Oliver, regretting his absence, wishing the conference well, and saying, among other things, that John was the nicest of men and the best of colleagues. Jean Fage is also unable to be with us, but is represented by her son Michael, who is here. And Michael, I want to embarrass somebody, it might as well be you. There you are. And I know that some members of CWAS from old will be very happy to have a word with Michael. You may not recognize him so well now when he's sitting down, but when he stands up, all I have to say is that he's at least as tall as his father. You will not miss him. It's a pleasure, Michael, to meet you again here, and it's wonderful for you to come to represent the family. Jean did, however, write to me, and I think it's appropriate that she should have the last word on what I wish to say. She writes as follows. I'm very proud of the achievements of John and so many others to have made the Centre such a success, and my thoughts will be with you all during this time. May the Centre continue long into the future with its plans for historical and other research and the creation of new scholarship, and may it continue to fulfill the desire by so many for excellence. Well, now, how we got from there to here in what is going to be 25 minutes. I have strong hopes that this will finally get into the Guinness Book of Records. I have been trying for years in the category listed for the most outrageous historical interpretation, but the competition is too fierce. Conference veterans will infer from my title that they are about to experience a flood of self-indulgent nostalgia. I shall do my best not to disappoint expectations. As those who know me can attest, it is a principle of mine always to stoop to challenges of a low order. Those of you who are relatively new to the conference scene, on the other hand, may already be wondering if you can manage a surreptitious Twitter or two in the hope of tuning out the ruminations of a scholar whose future so clearly lies behind him. Believe me, I feel your pain. I hope, however, for a measure of indulgence, because what follows is nostalgia with a purpose. I shall attempt to demonstrate, without visual aids, that nostalgia lives. Necromancy too. By conjuring up the spirits of past scholarly contributions, we can understand how current research priorities have arisen and even begin to peer into possible futures. The last 50 years span the greater part of modern historical scholarship on Africa. Before then, there were very few university courses on Africa, a very limited number of PhDs, and virtually no specialized journals. The first issue of the Journal of African History, as we just heard, with a fine attention to the truth as always, took place in 1960 when it was first published. What followed was a scholarly revolution, an unparalleled expansion of a subject that eminent skeptics said could not be invented. Today, as this audience well knows, there is an array of institutional support and a body of research of remarkable quality, depth, and almost overwhelming volume that was inconceivable half a century ago. The subject is now widely recognized and respected by the historical profession and has expanded into journals far beyond its own specialism. There are many ways of looking at these considerable achievements. My approach divides the literature into 5 historiographical phases that between them cover the last 50 years. I shall focus particularly on the influences that have affected economic and social history, but colleagues in other branches of the subject will immediately recognize the trends I outline. Each phase has had a lifespan of about 10 years, without counting antecedents and after effects. Each claimed to have a privileged route to truth. Each proved to have fatal flaws. Each claimed also to be the final solution to problems which we know are unending. I should take out some insurance against criticism at this point. I'm not suggesting that all historians marched under these banners, only that the 5 phases had considerable influence on successive generations of researchers. When the study of African history was getting underway in the 1960s, the social sciences were in the grip of modernization theory, which divided the world into 2 contrasting social formations, labelled traditional and modern. The guru of the subject was Talcott Parsons, an American sociologist, whose name is little known today outside his discipline, but who exerted an influence that even Edward Said would have envied. Parsons devised what were known as the pattern variables, a set of opposites that ordered the thinking of a whole generation of students, and was applied by development specialists to what was then becoming known as the underdeveloped world. History was irrelevant to the theory, which was derived from axioms that were logical, coherent, and comprehensive. Modern societies displayed the meritorious qualities you would expect: initiative, energy, rational thought. They also had appropriate supportive institutions, ranging from property rights to education. Traditional societies stood as a collective antonym. They were unenterprising, communal, emotive, and gripped by institutions such as the extended family that retarded development. The purpose of development policy was to achieve modernity by transforming tradition. The aim was clear. The task, though formidable, was within the reach of Western experts with the requisite resources at their disposal. Learned books were written on the subject. Stellar reputations were made. Social psychologists deconstructed, as we might now say, the folk tales of African societies. Architects designed housing that would hold nuclear families with 2.1 children and not a decimal point more. The edifice came down very quickly at the close of the 1960s. Social scientists exposed flaws in the assumptions and their application to parts of the world that refused to behave as the theory predicted. Becoming modern, it turned out, was no more than becoming like us, with footnotes for fig leaves. Historians also played a part in the demolition. The decolonization of Africa in the 1960s inspired researchers to liberate the past from unexamined Western stereotypes. As they did so, it became clear that pre-colonial Africa did not conform to the stereotype of static, uniform, and backward societies, but was dynamic, diverse, and enterprising. Whether or not tradition was invented by outsiders, it was undoubtedly being reinvented by insiders. To the surprise of those of us working in the shadows, history suddenly came into the sunlight. During the 1970s, the subject enjoyed a boom of Wall Street proportions and experienced signs of irrational exuberance too. Development problems were no longer seen to have been fixed from the time the Yoruba, as they say, came out of a hole in the ground, but resulted from historical actions. A new truth, the dependency thesis, characterized the second phase, gripped a fresh generation of students and swept all before it. Finally, it seemed we had a convincing yet still simple solution to complex problems. Africa was poor because Western capitalism had penetrated the continent from at least the time of the slave trade and had created the very state of underdevelopment that it was the duty of historians to expose and of economists to fix. Many more books were written. Many new reputations were made. The dependency thesis also validated a renewed emphasis on the period of colonial rule, which the shift to indigenous history had made momentarily unfashionable. A series of studies demonstrated the malign consequences of the colonial presence on Africa's development prospects. The few defenders of the colonial record who were still manning a gun or two were quickly overwhelmed. Black marks were handed out to colonial policies towards labour, land, taxation, transport, manufacturing, marketing, and of course to the expatriate firms. Life in the colonies was indeed nasty, British, and in shorts. The best that could be said, if you were British that is that the colonial subjects probably had a worse time under the French, Belgium, and Germany. A claim that made even faint praise seem an exaggeration. This pleasing uniformity, which also had the bonus of being politically correct, was disturbed by criticism from within. By the close of the 1970s, converts to the dependency thesis had become aware that their radicalism was a departure not just from something called bourgeois economics, but also from orthodox Marxism. The keepers of the covenant assailed the dependentistas for their heretical assertion that relations of exchange explained relations of production and the mechanism by which economies evolved. A new burst of energy took control of the subject during this third phase, which occupied the 1980s. What mattered, we were told, were class relations. The mode of production determined the composition of social classes, whose developing antagonisms in turn determined the evolution of society as a whole. The past could again be used to predict the future. Armed with this insight, fresh recruits sprang into action. The emphasis swung back to Africa's internal history. Modes of production were sought and found throughout the continent. Very soon we learned that Africa did not have farmers or cultivators, as some of us had thought, but peasants who inhabited a feudal order or one of its variants, a slave mode of production, a cattle mode of production, even, paradoxically you might think, a long-distance trade mode of production. Once again the Holy Grail was reached. Once again it proved illusory. After Africa's rich diversity had been satisfactorily classified into various modes of production, it became apparent that the exercise had merely relabeled the problem rather than solved it. Eventually, the high priests themselves raised their hands. Ex cathedra pronouncements declared an end to the fruitless search for modes of production in Africa. The feudal orders, like Longfellow's Arabs, folded their tents and silently stole away. By the close of the 1980s, the world was being turned upside down. The collapse of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War diminished the appeal of Marxism. After a short flirtation with the Annales school, historians found a satisfactory substitute in postmodernism, the fourth phase, which dominated historical studies during the 1990s and just into the turn of the present century. Antonio Gramsci provided the grappling iron that joined long-standing concerns with power and exploitation to colonial rule. Dominance was now to be found not in any material basis of production, but in what became known in the language of the day as moral hegemony. Marx too was upended. What mattered, we were told, were cultural representations of a tribe known as the other, who were portrayed through Western texts, symbols, museums and exhibitions as inferior beings. This imagery, applied to colonial Africa, had legitimated white dominance and encouraged Africans to believe that their subordinate status was well deserved. Cultural power became the central concern of a new generation of researchers. Studies of economic and political history were seen, or when seen at all, as derivative epiphenomena. More books were written, more reputations were made. Shares in Said, Spivak and Barber were at a premium. Those who still held stock in Gunder Frank, Wallerstein and Marx sat on big losses. Given its priorities, postmodernism contributed little to understanding Africa's long-term development issues. Indeed, a Martian reading the literature of the day could be forgiven for concluding that the problem of poverty in Africa had been solved. The edifice did not collapse overnight, as modernization theory did. It simply faded away at some point after the events of 9/11. Today's graduate students, forgive me if this is a mistake, but I will carry on with it. Today's graduate students have no idea who Foucault was, or maybe still is. Edward Said remains an eminent name, but even so, no longer one known in the whole household. The fifth phase began in the late 2000s and has still to reach maturity. The current trend, as everyone here knows, is the study of globalization, which is captivating the present generation of young researchers. The term is everywhere, though few historians have yet mastered the literature that underlies it. Historians have, however, reclaimed respectability for what Brodel called material life and the Longue Durée. What postmodernists dismissed as a misconceived totalizing project is back in fashion. Universal propositions universal propositions are once more colonizing the world. Reality, which had been accused of loitering with intent to deceive, has become a valued and largely unquestioned associate. In a remarkable feat of athleticism, we find ourselves leaping forward and back simultaneously. One interpretation of this abbreviated survey would see it as the endless gyration of scholarly tribes. My own conclusion is rather different. Each phase has inspired research of high quality and has explored features of the past that have been incompletely studied. Moreover, knowledge has not only accumulated, but also progressed, if in a crooked line. There are beliefs about Africa today that can be held only in the face of the evidence and not in the light of it. The main problem confronting researchers is that the principal gains from each phase arise early in the academic life cycle. Thereafter, diminishing returns set in. Early adopters secure disproportionate benefits. Latecomers are exposed to collateral damage. Research students who join a trend after the midway point will finish their dissertations when the phase in question has almost run its course, by which time no one wishes to know about the representations of yet another other or its equivalents. Such studies, though often meritorious, have short lives and quickly end as tombstones in the great graveyard of redundant publications. Since historiographical phases are not easily bypassed, the key question is to know how to recognize them and how to judge whether the point they have reached is one of youth, maturity, or senility. Several clues lie readily to hand. All the phases I have identified offer simple, comprehensive theories or at least approaches to a complex world. That is a large part of their appeal. However, the simplicity of the narrative is normally camouflaged by a special language, from the pattern variables to tropes and alterities, that hints at a higher, privileged understanding. Language constitutes a rite de passage. Fluency allows entry into the relevant scholarly tribe and has to be displayed thereafter to advertise continuing loyalty. The resulting literature is largely self-referencing. Most alternatives are discounted by ignoring them. It is also humorless and wholly lacking in self-irony, because dedicated introspection makes it hard for members of a tribe to see how puny their efforts are in relation to the size of the problem they're dealing with. The approach of senility is signaled by the unreflective repetition of a thesis established years earlier, and by increasingly convoluted theological disputes, often accompanied by accusations of heresy. When the music stops, tenured academics have already passed the parcel. Job seekers are left holding an outdated problematic. These clues suggest to me that the best way to avoid unemployment is through a grasp of historiography. This recommendation is not quite so obvious as it may seem. The trend of scholarship, certainly in the United States, is to concentrate on recent work on the assumption that the latest is the best. Otherwise, we would not cite it. This position has obvious merit, but it confines scholarship to short-term points of reference and excludes the classics, which are rarely cited and even more rarely read. Yet classic works have earned the title because they've survived changes of fashion over many generations. They help us to see the difference between the issue of the day and the riddle of the ages. Without such guidance, we can all easily fall into the practice of writing consignment history. It may be new to us, but it's not fresh from the factory. This very general recommendation can be refined by having an awareness of what moves and shakes in the United States, the powerhouse of academic research, which influences everyone else. The phases I have identified were all developed in and marketed by the United States, even though they all have cosmopolitan origins. Modernization theory was formulated at the height of post-war confidence and mobilized to help win the Cold War. The dependency thesis and Marxism were responses of a generation caught up in the movement for civil rights and opposition to the Vietnam War, and represented a growing disillusion with the failings of what was seen to be a faltering capitalist system. After the fall of the Soviet Empire, however, Marxism dematerialized, and the radical agenda lost much of its international reach and ambition. Postmodernism carried forward a radical strand of thought, but one derived principally from domestic issues such as multiculturalism and gender. Its proponents waved the flag of liberation, but shifted the battleground from the hazards of the barricades to the safety of the classroom. Interest in globalization quickened following the events of 9/11, which were demonstrably material as well as symbolic. Alarm at the rise of the East and the prospective fall of the West, and domestic uncertainties about the consequences of massive immigration from Spanish-speaking countries. The empire is indeed striking back in unsettling ways. Mexico is now reclaiming, informally, territory taken by force in the 19th century. The question underlying these shifting fashions is why policymakers and their advisors in universities and think tanks in the United States above all react to domestic and international events in the way that they do. The answer, you'll be glad to know, requires far more time than I have available. But the elements include an abiding sense of providential mission, a search for certainty in an inherently uncertain world, an unquestioned conviction that what is good for Chicago or Wall Street is indeed good for the world, and a virtually unlimited faith in the power of technology and capital to solve all human problems. These qualities have acquired immunity from refutation. History is repeated because even those who know it believe that they have the power to escape its most probable outcomes. The royal touch was once thought to cure scrofula. Today, in the hands of experts, it is thought to cure poverty. In this regard, the United States is following a route marked out by the European empires, which suffered the consequences of failing to recognize that dominance is temporary, whereas hubris is eternal. Africa has played a distinctive part in all of these plans for the world. Foreign commentators and experts have long regarded the African continent, more than any other, as a laboratory for testing theories that reflect their own preoccupations. Fascination with a civilization that seems to be furthest from their own has inspired Western experts to treat Africa as both an antonym and an exemplar. The image of backward, benighted Africa was and remains the ultimate challenge for what used to be called the civilizing mission. The contrasting image of natural, unsullied Africa has been called upon, though more rarely, to act as a reproof and as a sage. In this guise, the continent serves as the touchstone of last resort, our ultimate source of being, and the final guardian of eternal verities, which in rare moments of self-doubt we feel we have mislaid. We have arrived, in my case rather breathlessly, at the present day, and at a moment when development experts are giving increasing attention to Africa, which is seen as the home of the bottom billion, and the only continent that has failed so far to show clear signs of escaping the traps holding poverty in place. Much of the discussion continues to be characterized by short-term perspectives on long-term problems, which help to explain why assessments of Africa's prospects lurch from the hopeless continent to the African Renaissance and back. Yet out of Africa there is indeed always something new and surprising. Today, novelty is represented by a group of young, energetic, and influential economists who have jumped into the deep end of African history and emerged with a set of bold propositions about the role of geography, ethnicity, state formation, and colonial rule in causing or reinforcing Africa's continuing economic plight. They apply the techniques of new institutional economics, but set them in a global context, and in the longest of long runs that even stretches to prehistory. The claims that are emerging are provocative, yet so far historians have been slow to recognize, let alone respond to, research that occupies their own territory. Gareth Austin is one of the very few historians to have mastered the new literature and to have contributed significantly to it. And he will be speaking about aspects of it in a moment. I shall confine myself to a conditional conclusion, one that you can trust with all of the confidence you would now place in your bank. African economic history is about to experience a revival related to current interest in globalization. Since this, my fifth historiographical phase, is still at an early point in its evolution, it offers promising opportunities for new research and new researchers, with, as we in the academic service industry say, limited downside. A prediction I can make, however, with considerable certainty, is that John Fage would have been delighted to see African history, which he did so much to promote, move to the center of the debate on Africa's long-term development. Thank you.